Well, hey there, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to kick off our new Future of Cyber Insurance series with everybody here. For good reason, we spend a lot of time talking about how cyber insurance works today and the existing coverages and resources that are available to brokers and businesses. But the industry is at an inflection point, and the ways of doing things are beginning to fade as the future starts to come into focus. Now, as the pace continues to accelerate, we really think it's important that we help you stay on the cutting edge. So that's why we created the Future of Cyber Insurance series, and it's a forum so we can all take a chance to look ahead. So over the course of multiple sessions, we're going to dive deep into the innovations that are needed to drive our industry forward and help cement it as a long-term viable solution to help businesses of all shapes and sizes manage cyber risk for years to come. So to kick it off, we decided it made the most sense to start really at the beginning. The source of what's driving so many of the innovations that are helping our industry take shape start with data. And that's because we sit at a particularly unique position in the industry where we not only see threat actor behavior and vulnerability trends, but we can also see business impacts and losses as they pop up in claims. So in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to share how insurers can use real-time cyber risk data and security insights to inform the accuracy of underwriting, help businesses detect threats most likely to lead to claims, and also improve risk selection. So today we're really fortunate to have one of the leading innovators in this space with us help guide the discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tiago Henriques, Coalition's VP of Research. So Tiago, I'll kick it over to you.
Cool. Hi, everyone. What an absolute honor to be here today. I always love talking about the great work our teams do, and this is no exception. For me, I came to Coalition 5 years ago when Coalition acquired a company that I founded called Binary Edge that does large-scale data collection and internet scanning. I ran the security engineering teams that continued to improve our data collection efforts. These days, I run the research team, which focuses both on security and threats and artificial intelligence as well.
Great. Thank you, Tiago. And my name is Mike Volk. I'm a member of Coalition's product marketing team here, and I'm a former cyber insurance broker. So I did see a few questions in the chat. So let me go over a few quick housekeeping items before we dive in. So the session today will be recorded, and we're going to send out a link so you can watch it later. All participants are in listen-only mode, and cameras are off, but we do encourage participation. So if you'd like to ask questions during the presentation today, please use the Q&A option, not the chat. We're going to be monitoring Q&A, and we're hopefully going to have some time at the end where we can take some of those questions live. And with that, let's go ahead and kick it off. So before we get into it today, I wanted to start by looking at kind of taking a step back and looking at some of the perceived issues that some folks say are holding the cyber insurance industry back, or others argue are making cyber risk uninsurable or hard to insure long term. Includes things that you've probably heard, arguments that cyber risk is just too dynamic, things like we don't have enough historical cyber data, or that cyber risk doesn't neatly fit into the underwriting models that we're all used to. The reality is there's decent amount of truth to some of these statements, but rather than holding us back, what I want to do is take a look from a different angle. And when we do that, you kind of start to see a roadmap for the future start to take shape. So let's take a closer look at these arguments in the context of real data. So for the purposes of this presentation, what I'm going to do is pull a quick example from Coalition's internet scanning dashboard that shows IP scans since 2020. In this example, we're going to drill down into MySQL and the relevant versions. And as you can see, this helps validate that, yeah, cyber risk is pretty complex. But what it also does is it shows we know a lot more about cyber risk than we might realize. And by focusing on scanning activity of a popular database application like MySQL, we can actually see a good amount of historical data. Problem is, it's just not that useful because technology changes so quickly. For example, the version here in blue in the middle that spikes quickly drops to 0 when the new version in red is released and adopted. So what this shows is that real-time data and the ability to see trends is more useful than looking back in the past. So instead, we should stop looking in the rearview mirror and start leveraging real-time data to get a jump on unknown threats, help minimize surprises, and also help us expose blind spots. Now, finally, I hope this also illustrates the traditional approaches that rely heavily on point-in-time questionnaires, older actuarial models, and especially things like siloed historical data, it just doesn't work. So that's why we're building a new way forward. So what we're going to do now is take a closer look at what this actually means for risk selection, which is the topic for today, and why this data-driven approach is really so important to the ongoing development of cyber insurance. So to get us started, I wanted to ask Tiago a few questions to dig deeper into like how this actually works and how we can apply it. So just to get the discussion started, Tiago, I wanted to focus on one of the initial ideas that I brought up, that cyber risk is just too dynamic. It's not like other risks that we're used to. Can you help explain how data collection allows us to keep pace with cyber risk, and why the further development of these capabilities is really important in the way that we understand and ensure cyber risk?
For sure. I want to talk first about something you just mentioned, data collection, right? Because we hear from everyone they do scans. But that's something that's interesting at Coalition. When we talk about what we do, we don't say we do scans. We do data collection. And that means collecting a lot more than just scanning data at one point in time. It means continuous scans. It means us having honeypots, machines we put on the internet that appear to be vulnerable, appear to be running old software that is used by our policyholders, so that we can understand attacker behavior against it. This one on screen right now being the perfect example. We had our honeypots that were faking that they were running MoveIt, and we actually saw people scanning for MoveIt 6 months before the vulnerability and the large ransomware set of events happened. And this gave us a heads up that had nothing to do with scanning data, it had to do with our honeypot data. Then there's data leaks data. There's even things like commentary on Glassdoor and LinkedIn, like when employees are unhappy about a company. There's lots of different pieces of data that need to be collected for cyber to be underwritten properly. And that has to do with the complexity of cyber, the dynamism of cyber, but also the large spectrum of potential threats that exist in cyber. It can go from a company having a software that's vulnerable and an attacker exploiting a vulnerability to insider threats and someone on purpose or by mistake leaking a link, or a laptop being stolen from the back of a car that happened to have all the passwords for the company. There are lots of different types of threats in cyber, and therefore you need to have lots of different types of data and defenses against those as well. Also, collecting all of these data allows us to do two things. One, by collecting it in real time, it allows us to understand what is happening today and test signals that we have today. So, for example, we can understand trends like, hey, this technology is being attacked today versus this other technology that's being attacked tomorrow, how it's being attacked. And by the way, what are attackers doing after they compromise a machine? Are they deploying a crypto miner? Are they trying to deploy ransomware? Are they trying to steal data? Understanding not only the technology stack of the companies, but attacker behavior is a critical part of data collection. The other thing that's super interesting as well is Coalition collects this historically. And how that is important is because we can observe these changes in behavior. So it's not necessarily about, hey, the company is running, not just about the company running software from X time. It's interesting for us to observe the changes in pattern. When a new version of a software comes out, how fast is this company adopting and updating and patching? What versions are exposed on the internet of this new vulnerability that just came out? There's lots and lots of context that we can get and useful information for underwriting from continuous data collection.
Yeah, and I think what you just went through leads into what I want to talk about next. So when I started off, we talked about the idea that, cyber risk is complex, which it certainly is, but we can gather a lot of data and we can collect a lot of information. And then we get to the idea that, well, maybe we don't have enough historical data. And the reality is we have a lot of historical data, but we also have a lot of real-time data. And we also have a lot of data that is trending towards the future. So the reality is not necessarily that we don't have enough data, is that we have a lot, and we're getting a lot of really important signals about what's happening, and we can start to put the pieces together. But with that, now we have to figure out a way to follow those trends. So needless to say, this is a bit of a shift in the way that we're thinking about cyber risk, especially when it comes to insurance. So can you help us explain, or can you help explain how things like analytics and emerging AI strategies are starting to be applied to help make sense of the complexity so that we're able, or at least better prepared, to follow the trends and detect the issues earlier so that we can apply them to insurance?
Absolutely. There are many different parts to this problem. One, when you start collecting data, our CEO Joshua likes to use the expression that it's a little bit like eating an elephant because we get a lot of data. You know, when you scan the entire internet the way we do, when you have thousands of honeypots exposed that generate billions of events every day, you just get a lot of data. And unfortunately, for us as humans, we happen to have some limitations, which is this beautiful brain that is really, really good at certain things and unfortunately not so great at other things. And that's where machines come in. They can come and help us. And machines are great at looking at vast quantity of data and detecting these patterns, detecting these trends, and essentially bubbling those up to us humans, and then us making the decision of what we want to do about a certain trend or a certain pattern that we're seeing. So there are multiple parts where AI can and will be used in insurance. One, large scale data lake, however you want to call it, like a large set of data sets using AI to essentially bubble up those trends, bubble up those patterns in real time as we're seeing them. That's one part. The second part as well is then crafting a narrative that everyone can understand. It's super easy for anyone on my team, for example, a security analyst, to go into our data lake, look at the data we have on a company, and understand, hey, this is what's dangerous about this company. It's a completely different problem when we're talking about our context here for insurance, where a broker needs to understand what the problem is. The policyholder, who might be the CFO or the CEO, someone that's not technical, needs to understand what type of risk they're exposed to. And AI can help a lot in there as well. These new advancements in LLMs, large language models, make it that you can essentially tell an LLM, hey, explain this to me in a really simple way. And it will generate custom text that is essentially like with examples, or make it a lot more simple to explain technical concepts to non-technical people. So AI is going to be used not just for detection and analysis, but also for explainability of those detections and those analysis as well. It's going to be used across the entire spectrum of cybersecurity, essentially. As an example here, this is actually a great example. I was just going to say, this is our honeypot dashboard. And if you look to the top left-hand corner, in the last 30 days, just in our honeypots, take into account that Coalition has about 20 to 30 different collection mechanisms. Just on the honeypots, we have 9.5 billion, with a B, 9.5 billion events in just the 30 days. Now imagine being a human and trying to look at 9.5 billion things and finding little needles in that gigantic haystack. Because that's the thing, out of those 9.5 billion, what you want to find is, what are these new attacks? What are the anomalies? What are we seeing today that we weren't seeing yesterday or the week before? And that is where machines are great. That's where they thrive. Mike?
Yeah, and this leads directly to the next point. So like, all right, so we're collecting all this data. We're deploying new technology to analyze and make sense of it. I like what you said, finding those needles in the haystack here, which it really is, and it's very hard for a human to do. You're taking the security brain with the actuarial brain, putting them together. Now is where the rubber meets the road for insurance. Now we're starting to apply these things to insurance methodologies, not starting from scratch and creating new ones, but kind of rebuilding the ones that have worked forever from the ground up, but using the new data, using the new approaches. Can you explain how we can do this successfully? Like how can we take these new ways of collecting, analyzing, and applying cyber risk data and pave the way for new models built specifically for cyber insurance, which haven't really been done before?
For sure. One of the things that's interesting about the way the research team works and how Coalition has structured itself is we are an incredibly eclectic team. As we started to look at cyber and try to understand the complexities of cyber risk, we knew we needed to take a different approach. So we grabbed people from different backgrounds. My team, the research team, has actuaries, data scientists, security analysts, software engineers, academics, industry professionals, all working under the same roof. And then we bring in other teams closely to us as needed on a per project basis. An example of this is, and if you don't mind going to the next slide, would be our actuarial model. We work incredibly close to our actuarial team, where every account that comes in to Coalition, every company that comes in to be quoted, we assign it a risk quantile. And essentially, you can think of one being the low accounts of lowest risk, five being the ones of highest risk, based on the AI, machine learning models. All of the facts that our teams generate then are reused by our actuarial team to generate these quintiles, their model. And you can see essentially this graph is showing that it's working. When we say an account is a risk quintile of 5, it has a frequency and loss cost that is higher than 4, than 3, than 2, than 1. And this is exactly what you want to see in an actuarial model. You want to see that when the actuarial model is saying, hey, this account is a higher risk, we should price it higher, that overall, over time, you see this. And this graph is an example of the great work done by the research and actuarial team, essentially combining the years of insight of actuarial methods with the dynamism, data collection, cyber expertise of the research team, all coming together into one model, which is our pricing model.
Yeah, this is great. So you can clearly see how this is all driving towards that concept of improving risk selection, and it carries through the policy period, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But what I want to try to do now, so we've talked a lot about the theory, where the industry is going, the new techniques and methodologies that we're deploying that are shaping things like what you just talked about. I think a lot of times it's hard to see this in practice because a lot of times we don't get a behind the scenes look. We're not like you. We're not working with the data day in and day out. So what I want to do now is kind of shift gears and go a layer deeper. And have you kind of walk us through a little bit of the methodology, but then take us through actually a live demo, so we can actually see how the data looks from your perspective and how it's actually deployed in models like this. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for the next slide.
So this is a great example. This is how we talked about our risk view in 2023. And one of the interesting things about cyber and Coalition is we're always evolving how we think about cyber risk and how we view cyber risk. In 2023, we focus a lot on which vulnerabilities are being exploited, and we would decline accounts, and even companies that were similar, one would have the vulnerability, the other wouldn't, and we would decline one company but write a policy to the other one. But we need to continuously evolve, pull in even more data. And this is how we're thinking about our risk view in 2024. If you don't mind, Mike, going to the next slide. There we go. As you can see here, we're now starting to take into account a lot more defensive controls data. Does the company patch correctly? Have they filled out our security checklist and gave positive responses? Are the vulnerabilities that are currently present in the company only in their demo environment versus in their production environment? Are they using on-prem email, or are they using online, cloud-provided email? How many cloud providers do they use? Are they multi-cloud? Are they multi-region? We're starting to get a much more granular and complex view of the risk. And guess what? The more complex you go, the more data is needed, the more support from the robots you're going to need as well. So we're using AI essentially to consume all of this data and do the fact finding for us, essentially raising just the highlights of this account. And I'll show this in a little bit in my demo.
And with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing here and turn it over to you so you can actually walk us through it.
Oh, let's do this. So we'll look first. Let me see here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So we'll look here at an example. What I'm showing you on screen is the Coalition active graph. And this is about 1/10 of all the data Coalition has on this company being Change Healthcare. It looks a little bit weird, but as I start to zoom in, you'll be able to see this really looks like a spaghetti. But essentially, you can think of this as a graph. A graph essentially has nodes, which are these little dots, and edges, which are the connections between the dots. And this is kind of how Coalition sees and thinks about cyber risk. We think about it as things that are all connected and may impact each other. And then we think of them, some of them being positive, some of them being negative, some of them being neutral. So for example, if I zoom in, you'll see lots of gray dots, which are neutral. You'll see blue ones, which are informative, but you also see, for example, red dot here, which is a data leak. So essentially credentials that were leaked on the dark web associated with this company. One interesting case is Change Healthcare. Change Healthcare is one of the biggest healthcare companies in the US, and they were hacked. And they were down for a long, long time and impacted a large amount of pharmacies all over the US. What's interesting about Change Healthcare is their CEO was actually called in front of Senate. And in front of Senate, he admitted, hey, Change Healthcare was hacked because we had a Citrix that did not have multi-factor authentication enforced. Let's break that statement apart. Citrix, it's an application a company can use to allow remote users to access assets of the company. Essentially, if you want to access a remote computer, you would do that with a Citrix. MFA, multi-factor authentication. Essentially, you type your password and you usually get an SMS or you have to insert the second code that goes to your phone. And they didn't have that activated in the Citrix. Two things can happen to that Citrix. One, they can be a target of credential brute forcing, meaning an attacker can go and try millions of usernames and passwords. Or the second thing can happen, which is users that have legitimate credentials to access that system can have their computers compromised, and then hackers can steal those credentials and log in into the Citrix themselves. The interesting thing is the Citrix for Change Healthcare is this one over here, remoteapps.changehealthcare.com. And I'm going to turn off our details mode here for a second, and I'm going to click on it. And as you can see, lots of red dots are connected to this Citrix, to this asset. That means there were multiple credentials recently available that were stolen by bad guys that would have allowed them access to this Citrix that was owned by Change Healthcare, which would then give access to the rest of the company. And if we click on it, we can go to relationships and we can see, obviously, we hide the username and passwords for obvious reasons, but you can see that there were multiple data leaks, multiple credentials that had been stolen that would have given attackers access to this asset of Change Healthcare, which is where everything started. The other interesting thing I like showing about our graph, we don't just collect domains data, right? So if you jump in here, we have a company called Buzzballs. And one of the interesting things I like telling brokers is, please, 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 when filling out cyber insurance applications, give us all the information, because that's the only way we can help companies know the potential digital risk they're exposed to. What do I mean by that? Buzzballs actually is owned by Southern Champion. And Southern Champion actually has a bunch of other brands that would have been covered under their initial policy as well. So ideally, when filling out the policy for Southern Champion, the broker should give us all the domains for all the different entities, not just for Southern Champion or not just for Buzzballs. Of course, we use AI to do brand discovery as well when any submission comes in. And our AI, when Southern Champion gets submitted, automatically discovers Andrew John's Jeans, Crooked Fox, Uptown Cocktails, and Buzzballs as well. And if you zoom in, you'll actually see each of these subsidiaries, other brands, has their own domains as well. So, and which has their own IP addresses, which has their own technology, which has their own vulnerabilities. And this goes on and on and on. It's important that when you're filling out that cyber insurance application, make sure your client has given you every brand, every subsidiary, everything that they own, so that we can do a proper assessment of risk, price it correctly, but also over time, help your customer. because we continuously monitor all of our policyholders. When a new vulnerability comes out, Coalition usually notifies the policyholder that they're vulnerable, and now we're after the technical details of the vulnerability are announced. And we can only do that if you work with us. If there's recent acquisitions the policyholder has done, make sure you reach out to us. Tell them to go into Coalition Control and add that domain in. They can do it for free. They're not going to pay extra for that. And we will monitor those domains for them. And as you can see here, our graph collects all sorts of data from IP addresses, data leaks, subdomains. If we zoom in here, we can see we analyze the terms and conditions on the websites of the different companies. And we use all of these to successfully underwrite cyber/digital risk. As I mentioned earlier, AI automatically raises like a risk summary. Essentially, instead of an underwriter having to look at all those dots all the time, which are super useful, for example, if you're a security analyst trying to understand potentially risk that's correlated, an underwriter can just come to risk summary and look at what red flags, yellow flags, and green flags exist on an account. And this is essentially AI that's doing this work for us. Mike, back to you.
All right, let me pull up my screen back up.
I'll answer a quick question from the chat, Mike, while you're pulling that up. Utaro, you asked if this chart is Maltego for node analysis. The mental approach is the same. Maltego also works with nodes and relationships. This is just custom built in-house because the scale of data points that we have is way too big for something like Maltego to be used.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the demo. I know I've seen it. You go through that a few times, and every time you go through it, I feel like I learned something about the way that we're applying data to this really unique problem. And one of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about, the amount of data, how we're applying it to underwriting, was the idea that we're not stopping at underwriting. We're not stopping at risk selection. We're helping organizations learn from all the things that you just showed them through a tool of cyber insurance. So we're helping them find things that not only are, risks and threats that are out there, but when you connect it with what you detected with business impacts and risks that we see pop up in claims, now we can help a business say, here's an exposure unique to you that is also likely to lead to a business impact, aka claim. And this is because of the data collection that we have and the ability to bring the risk and security data together with actuarial and cyber insurance data. And what we're able to do is find when there's an exposure, we can get to a point where we're able to say, all right, if this is present in a network, it's going to increase the likelihood of a potential claim by X amount. And that's so powerful because as we go through the policy period, we're able to, like Tiago said, through Coalition Control, we can help alert on those new things that are going to pop up dynamically throughout the policy period to keep the client secure, to help them mitigate issues that they may not have otherwise known about. And then this all leads back to insurability as they go through renewal. If you deal with them now, less you have to deal with before you get into the renewal, and then it continues. So over time, we're building the security through insurance because we're able to apply the technology and the data that Tiago showed. And what I have here is just a few examples from our most recent claims data, which we continuously keep updated. Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about here is just another example of the proof points. And what I want to show here is how improving risk selection and security throughout the policy period is starting to actually materialize in the data that we're able to track. So what I want to show on this slide is some data from, this is actually from the past 12 months. So, from today all the way back to this time last year. And it illustrates how some of the recommendations that we're making are, materially impacting the organization, or they show up in real life. And what I have here is examples from when we go in and try to underwrite a policy. And, in every case, every business is different. So not every organization's, willing or able to take our recommendations at that time. And this means that some organizations don't address some of the things that we recommend. And then the result is that they don't necessarily bind coverage with us. And what we're able to do is track this using public data, and we can align that with the security recommendations. And what the picture that starts to paint is that the security recommendations are absolutely aligning with some of the security issues that we see pop up. So as we wrap up today, I wanted to share this because I believe it's a really powerful representation of how cyber insurance is really helping businesses make smart decisions about cybersecurity and cyber risk. And another thing that it shows is we also have a lot of work ahead of us. We're talking about the future of cyber insurance. We have a lot of work to continue helping organizations see that this is meaningful, impactful data, and help them take proactive steps to avoid potentially avoidable losses. And I think that's a really good way to I think see and use this data, especially based on what Tiago walked us through. So I don't know if you have anything else to add here, Tiago, but I think it's a good example of how this actually comes together in real life.
Just that, I would just add that these are numbers, obviously, as an insurance company, we're proud of. It validates our risk selection. But my happy world is the day we get to where we see a zero where that 281 is. Like and I say this because something I usually tell brokers, even if you don't bind an account with Coalition, every single account will have a CRA, a Coalition risk assessment. We give you the data that your customer needs to protect themselves. So make sure you're giving that CRA to your customer. Like, obviously, we would all love if you bound accounts with Coalition, but even if you don't, make sure you're running your customer through that CRA, because the data in there is incredibly valuable for them to protect themselves, for them to understand the digital risk they're exposed to.
That's a great point. And getting to zero here would be ideal. That's what we're working towards. Future of cyber insurance. So just really quickly, just to wrap up, we covered a whole lot. So I wanted to just do one more wrap up of the key takeaways as we wrap up the discussion. So we kind of went through a few of the issues that are potentially holding cyber insurance back, flipped that on its head, and really showed that this is a roadmap for the future. So doing things like improving data collection, as Tiago walked us through, really helps us understand cyber risk and what we're up against. And we actually know a lot. And the idea here, the second one is, historical data is useful, but it's a very small part of the picture. So we really need to take a shift from that historical data approach to rapid detection, applying things like AI so that we can start to be more real time with the way that we're collecting and applying data. And then finally, applying all of this to the insurance methodologies, to things like risk selection, as well as continuing that throughout the policy period. So that we can help organizations not only, qualify for cyber insurance, get good coverage, but also mitigate and avoid risks along the way. Now, we do have some additional information that we will share after the presentation. So the first thing we will share is we've recorded the session today, so we're gonna send out a recording to the presentation so you can take a look at that later and share it with others in your teams. We're also gonna share a link to we have a website dedicated to this that goes through our active data graph. And at the end of the page, we also link to our cyber threat index, which is probably the best representation of our data in a report form. So we'll send all of that out after the session so you can take a deeper look at some of the things that we went over today. And we do have a few minutes left here.
We have a few questions on the Q&A. Shall we go over them? Matthew Clark asks, when you mention a critical vulnerability, are you referring to CVs or vulnerabilities in general? Actually, Coalition spends a lot of time doing curation of which vulnerabilities the clients should care about. We actually launched, and I'll paste the link in our chat here, an exploit scoring system. Essentially, for every CV that comes out, typically only between 2 and 5% actually are going to be used by attackers. So we spend time looking at every CV that comes out and making sure that we're only notifying clients of things that are critical, things that are actually being used by attackers. So when you get a critical from Coalition, it matters. It is important. It isn't something that we're saying, hey, patch just for the sake of patching. It's because we are seeing active exploitation of that vulnerability, either via our honeypots or via our incident response team, which my team works very closely with as well. So when a claim happens, our incident response team goes in, does the forensics, understands how the company was hacked, and they let us know which vulnerability was used to hack into that company. I hope that answered your question, Matthew. I see Tom Harrington asked, what is a Fortinet device, for example? So for certain devices, we don't have a way with scanning to see how they're configured. So when we see a company using certain technologies, we will send you a list of actions we want you to take. So for Fortinet, we will ask, do you have the latest patch installed? Do you have MFA enforced across all users? Do you have the admin panel for that device restricted to a VPN or a zero trust solution? So that is an example of when we notify about a risky technology. Instead of giving you a specific action, we give you a checklist of things we would love for you to do against that device. Lindsay Hutanen asks us, is that report included with the quote documents? Every single coalition quote, and if the company has a domain, should contain a CRA. If it doesn't, please make sure you're contacting us and we will get you a CRA, coalition risk assessment, for that company.
And then one other thing I'll add here, if you quote with us, we're also able to provide pre-bind access to coalition control, which Tiago mentioned earlier, which gives them additional insights and additional ability to look at that risk, which will then continue if they decide to bind coverage with us.
We have a client that the home head office is in Barbados and their sub office is here in Alberta. Can we provide coverage in both countries? As far as I'm aware, we can only do it for Alberta. We are currently not selling cyber insurance in Barbados, but if you reach out to us, we can get into more details about that as well. Kerrigan, thank you for joining. We will be sharing the recording and other links. Satoshi Ozeki asks, it is said that cyber risks accumulate. What are your thoughts on this? We have our own accumulation model that we've built at Coalition that uses a very different view from what I've seen in the market. Specifically that usually aggregation vendors use purely statistical approach, meaning we think 60% of the market uses Windows, therefore our models are going to use 60%. Our model does. Our model uses actual data from scans, from data collection to try and get to as much realistic scenarios as possible. We do believe there is accumulation in cyber. We have a lot of questions around the level of exposure. We do not believe it's as extreme as maybe some other vendors are trying to make it seem. And an anonymous attendee asked us about Fortinet. I've responded to that. Essentially, it's a checklist of things that we want the insurer to do. They should just be able to go through that checklist with very specific asks: patching, remove admin interfaces off of the internet, MFA enforced. When an application asks for domains, is that email addresses? It depends. It's essentially what's sitting in front of the @ symbol of the email address. If that is Gmail or Outlook.com, we don't need that. We'll be able to see that. But if it is, there are certain companies that will use, for example, let's say the company is called ABC Inc. They can use abc.com for their website, but then they use bdc.com for email only. We would want both of those. We have a great blog post. Mike, I'm going to challenge you to find it, written by Michael Carr, that talks about domains. If you wouldn't mind sharing in the chat, that would be great. Great question, Lindsay, by the way. Not dumb at all. Really, really great question. Once a company has been hacked, are they more likely to be attacked again or less likely to be attacked again? This is a really, really great question as well, Tom. It depends. It depends on the behavior the company has after that initial hack. Hackers don't care. Hackers have two things to know about hackers. One, they're incredibly lazy. And two, they're incredibly lazy because they can afford to be incredibly lazy. When they have access to a vulnerability, they'll spray the entire internet with that vulnerability, and they'll get a bunch of machines compromised, which belong to companies, which they can then ransom. So hackers aren't thinking, oh, I've hacked this company once, I'm going to go hack them or not hack them again. They're going to spray the entire internet, and if remediation was not properly done, that company is going to get compromised again. If remediation was properly done and they invested in security, they are less likely to be hacked again. So it's more dependent on the behavior of the company rather than anything on the attacker side. There are exceptions. There are what are typically called threat actors, which are government sponsored, but smaller companies tend to not be attacked by those groups. Those groups tend to essentially target very specific targets that are important for their government or for whoever is their sponsoring party. But in general, for normal hacking groups that ask for ransoms, they don't care. They have a vulnerability that they're going to spray the internet and they'll get what they get because that works for them. Do you use your tech and data models to monitor cloud platforms? Matthew, what a great question. We just launched a set of new features where customers can integrate their AWS account, Office 365, and Google Workspace accounts with Coalition Control, our risk management platform. And the reason why customers should do that, one, it will qualify you for a better premium and potentially for policy preferences as well. That's on the side though. On the other side, Coalition will be able to go to the configuration of your account and tell you things you would need to change to make it more secure. So for example, if you don't have MFA enforced, and there's a difference between enabled and enforced for all the users in your company, we will let you know and give you step-by-step actions on how to activate that security features. And we are adding more and more platforms to our integrations feature in Coalition Control every single week. So make sure you keep an eye on that and make sure you're telling your policyholders to use Coalition Control.
And Tiago, I did find the blog post and I posted it up here in the chat so everybody can access it.
Perfect. Any last questions for me and Mike? I think this is us, Mike.
We got it.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Mike, thank you so much for organizing. We appreciate you all. I appreciate you giving us your time and asking all these interesting and great questions. Mike?
Yeah, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you joining us for the first session today. As I mentioned, stay tuned for keep an eye out for the recording link and some additional resources. Also, stay tuned for the next topic in the series, and we hope to see you then. Thanks, Tiago. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.